I can put him on speakerphone, worst case right now until.
It's just, I don't understand.
Aaron, you should be able to get back into the Zoom right now.
Alright, I'm losing a little bit. I'm gonna pull together here.
It should be the same link, yes. I think.
I might, oh, here.
We apologize for the delay. The office meeting lasted a little longer than we anticipated, so otherwise this would have started at 12:30.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I don't. Says that everything is.
I see your face, Aaron.
I need to know who I need to call
Can you hear me?
or.
So I can not hear you through the.
Hold on. Can you, Aaron, say something really quick?
Aaron, will you talk?
Testing, testing.
No, still no.
That's Aaron for all of you. Or as I sometimes say, AA Ron. Thank you for laughing. Appreciate you.
That's right. So you can hear us, right?
I can hear you.
Oh,
yay!
yay! I don't know what we did. I don't know what I did.
Okay, hang on.
What did I do? Hold on. Okay, speaker, audio box 2, and microphone 2. I got it.
Hallelujah.
I was about to cry, so thank you for coming.
Okay, you got it?
Somehow.
We love
Wait,
you,
let me take a
Rachel.
picture of this. Hold on. Okay, go for it. Sorry.
Aaron, you're on, live.
On? You can hear me?
Yeah.
All right. All right, well, I heard Blair introduce me, but again, my name's Aaron Baroni. I'm an attorney and manage our Upper Arlington office. So as she mentioned, I'm always available for questions, not just regarding Firpta, hopefully, but for anything that you need help with in your real estate world. But what Blair had asked me to talk about today was Firpta, which most people can go through an entire career in real estate and never have to deal with. But the purpose of talking about it is because, you need to know how to deal with it when it does come up. So to rewind a little bit as far as why Firpta exists is all tied to capital gains. So if you've ever represented sellers, which I'm sure you have, you've probably heard the title company ask them a list of questions. Have they lived there for 2 out of the last 5 years? Did they rent the property and so forth? So every seller could potentially have to pay capital gains when they sell their home. But if you live in the house as your residence and you don't rent it out, there's some other questions about it. But most of the time, if it's your residence, you don't have to pay gains, meaning if you make $100,000 on the sale of the house, you keep $100,000. Capital gains comes into play if you didn't live there or if it was an investment property, and can be anywhere to 20 to 25% tax off the top of your gains. So where Firpta comes into place is foreign investment in real property. So, it is somewhat more common these days. We're getting cash buyers from overseas, which there is zero restriction on buyers anywhere in the world buying property in the United States. Most of the times when that happens, it's cash transactions, but Firpta does not apply when a foreign person or entity buys property. So if you run into, an investor that's overseas, you don't have to deal with it up front, but what I talk about today is something you'll have to convey to them that they will have to deal with when they sell. So how does this come into play? Blair passed some things out. One of the things that's right in your contract is 13.7. So if you ever look at your contract, there is a Firpta section that most people don't know exists. And it does say if a seller is a foreign person, that a withholding has to occur. It's 10 to 15% of the sale price. The big thing about this is the IRS makes the buyer liable for the withholding. So I'll say that again. If a seller is a foreign person and has to pay capital gains, the buyer is liable for making sure those are withheld. The only logic I can think of is the IRS knows that the buyer is going to be here in the United States. And so they put the burden on them to determine whether this withholding needs to happen. So our contract deals with it and states that, you know, as agents, you need to make sure whether or not the seller is a foreign person or not. So the goal of talking about this with realtors is, you know, if this is something that applies, it's much easier to find out what to do if it's found out early in the process, preferably before a property is even listed. So how this would play out in the real world, this is the way that we don't want it to happen. Title companies have a Firpta affidavit that sellers sign that states they're not a foreign person. And on that document, they have to fill out forwarding address and social security number. So we sit down at a closing, we're signing the seller docs, they go through that form and we find out they don't have a social security number. And a few more questions are asked and we realize that a Firpta withholding applies. Not a good time to find that out at a pre-sign or at a closing because it's likely to delay closing. So if this is something that a title company finds out last minute, you're most likely not closing on time. So that's why it's so important to come up with a plan as how to deal with this. What we do as a title company, we send out that Firpta affidavit well before closing to let the listing agent know that they / their seller will have to be signing that at closing. As realtors, when we do our CE classes, we always talk about you having a really good checklist of things to think about. This is something that you're going to want to add to that list. Is there any reason that your seller would be a foreign person? And a foreign person is defined as somebody that's not a U.S. citizen and does not have a green card. The way I look at it is, if you don't pay taxes in the United States, you're most likely a foreign person. And Firpta knows that if you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't pay taxes, they want to get that money up front because once that property is sold, the odds of them getting those capital gains are slim. So how does this all work? You get a seller, you ask the questions, you find out that they are in fact what's considered a foreign person. There's a couple things. The best thing to do, the most well planned out thing to do, is to get them to a tax attorney or CPA well before they list the property, because they can file for what's called a tax withholding certificate. That's basically the sellers reaching out to the IRS, and I'm just paraphrasing, saying, hey, I'm selling a house, I am a foreign person, what's my withholding going to be? Or what's the capital gains that I'm going to have to pay? The IRS will submit a withholding certificate, tell the seller what they have to pay, and come closing time, the title company can make sure that's collected, and that's all that needs to happen. The issue with that is that takes the IRS up to 90 days. So if you get a listing, want to put it on the market right away, you're not going to have time to do that. But if you think about this and you have a client that this might apply to, there are options to avoid any closing delays. So that's option one. Option two is we deal with it through the closing. So same hypothetical, your seller is defined as a foreign person. They don't have that withholding certificate, so we have to deal with it at closing. So what does that mean? If they're selling a $500,000 house, they have to hold 15% of the sales price from their closing and submit it to the IRS. It doesn't matter how much money they make, doesn't matter if they make $0 on the transaction, it's straight off the top of the sales price. That money, along with a lot of forms signed by both the buyer and seller, go to the IRS. The seller then has to file a tax return and determine whether they get that money back. So while we as a title company, and I've just ended up being the person that has dealt with this the most in our company, we know enough as to how this needs to work at a closing, but we're not CPAs or tax attorneys. So we can tell this to you, to your clients, but the important thing is that they get to somebody who can help them with the forms and answer those questions. There are a few exceptions. They don't help too much, I'll be 100% honest, but if the sales price is under $300,000, and the second prong is that the buyer is going to reside in the property, then regardless of whether or not the seller is foreign, there's no withholding required. So under 300,000 and the buyer is going to live there, you don't have to worry about it. So if the buyer's investor going to rent the property, you can't use that exception. If the purchase price is over 300,000, you cannot use that exception. In this market, most houses seem to be going for more than 300,000, so it's not a exception that's going to help on all transactions, but it does exist. So one of the forms I passed out is kind of a chart as to like if this then that. So if you've got that in front of you, just take a quick look, and it kind of outlines whether or not it's going to apply to the transaction. It's just a good tool to have. Again, you shouldn't be giving tax or legal advice, but it explains what happens if the person is not a foreign person, then obviously there's no withholding. If they are, the second tier goes down to, the sales price. Under 300,000, possibly zero withholding. Above 300, but under $1 million, 10% off the top. Over $1 million, 15% off the top. So, those are the basics of this complicated rule. But in reality, what happens is everybody gets panicked when this comes up because one, the seller just realizes they're not going to get all their proceeds, and two, the buyer realizes they're going to have to sign tax forms and they have no clue what their liability is other than that the title company is telling them that they're responsible to make sure this is happening. So we've done a decent amount of these, and if everyone's on board and communication's good, we can get through it. The forms are signed at closing, not produced by us, but they bring the tax forms. We withhold the percentage from the seller's proceeds as a deduction and cut a check straight to the IRS. And then the buyer and seller work together to get those forms sent in, and that's really it. So it can be done if we know about it. We being title company, realtors, buyers, sellers, it can be done within the terms of the contract, but it needs to be determined upfront when the whole process starts. Otherwise, the big thing here to remember is that this could delay a closing. Another thing to keep in mind is that most of the time you deal with this, you have to be sensitive to the fact of how you ask the question of whether or not someone's a foreign person. I go back to the list of things you need to ask. And the simplest way I can think of to ask this question is to a seller when you have a listing is, does 13.7 apply to you? Are you able to close without having to do any withholding? And depending on that answer, you move on from there. Most of the time, obviously, it's not going to apply. The most common one that we run into is there's a hockey team in Columbus called the Blue Jackets. And most of the players are Canadian nationals and they're not US citizens. So we've done closings for several, and that the Firpta withholding is required some of those times depending on their status. And 100% of the time, those properties are over $300,000. So we had to do withholding. I worked with one gentleman who had a team, and I'm not kidding, of about 10 attorneys and tax lawyers up in Canada that were handling this, and it was somewhat complex, and the buyer was pretty nervous about it, but it got done. So, you can run into it once in a while. It's not something, again, you could go through your whole real estate career and not run into it. It's just knowing it exists and knowing enough. Again, you don't have to know everything about it. I don't know everything about it, but knowing enough to get your people the information they need to successfully close the sale of their property. I also passed out the Firpta frequently asked questions. These come directly from our underwriter, First American. Some pretty good questions in there if you want to read through that. I'm not going to go through all of them. But one of the questions I get and that we've run into is, two people are in title. Well, let's just say the husband is a foreign person and the wife is not. Question one, does the withholding apply if they're foreign? Well, it applies to 50% of the proceeds. And the follow-up question I get is, can't we just deed it out of the foreign person's name to avoid the Firpta withholding? The answer to that is no, that's fraudulent transfer. We're not going to advise you to do that to avoid the IRS. So there's some questions there as to how it applies. If the seller is a foreign person, in hindsight's, it's easy to say, try to get a withholding certificate, but it takes the IRS 90 days because most people don't realize that they need this until it's too late for that. So again, it can be dealt with within the time frame of a normal closing, as long as everybody knows about it up front. That's really my understanding of it and what I come across. And the most logical way I can explain it is tying it to capital gains and how the IRS essentially enacted this to make sure they get paid, essentially. And I know a lot of agents see a lot of overseas investment losing out to cash buyers, LLCs, and things like that. So when these properties flip around and they start selling the properties, we may run into this more and more. So usually when I talk about this, people are terrified and hope they never run into it and never have to deal with it. But I always open up for questions to see, what is on the top of your mind after hearing all that. Other than that, you don't want to deal with it. Nobody? I can't hear you, Blair. So maybe it's muted on your end. Yeah, it says that Keller Williams is muted, so that's probably why.
How about now?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. Okay. If you all have any follow-up questions that you think of after today or just later today, feel free to reach out to me, Blair Bishop. My number is 740-816-7129. You're grabbing a pen, so I'll repeat that. Okay, 740-816-7129. You can also call our office to connect with Aaron directly, 614-273-0421. Again, 614-273-0421. And then, do any of you on Zoom have questions? Chelsea or Fawn? Maybe not. Okay. Well, thank you all. What?
What was his name?
That's Aaron Brony. Aaron. Or Barone.
Yeah, and if you take anything out of what I just discussed, it's that, if it comes up, you've got someone that you can call and we can figure it out together. No one's going to expect you to know everything about this. So, and just like anything, not just Firpta, if any issues come up, that's what we're here for. Making sure closings go smoothly and everybody gets to closing and you know, gets referrals and makes a living and does all that good stuff. So just let us know if you have any questions.
Yes. Exactly. Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you all on Zoom.
Yeah, no problem.
And I
Have a good one.
later. Thanks. Bye, Erin. Thank
Bye.
you. You're welcome, Chelsea.